On a quiet night in Manhattan, Richard James, a successful millionaire, is having dinner with his wife Vanessa when she gets up to the bathroom. At this point, a homeless girl, visibly scared, approaches the table and makes a shocking revelation. "Uncle, your wife wants to kill you today." The words, loaded with fear and urgency, leave Richard paralyzed. He tries to understand what is happening, but the girl, with lost look, insists that his wife is involved in something terrible. Now Richard finds himself in a crossroads between love and betrayal, and a question persists. Who is really Vanessa? The restaurant was elegant, with a panoramic view of Manhattan that stretched to the horizon, where the city's lights flashed like stars. Richard James, a 52-year-old man, was the typical successful billionaire, charismatic, confident, and surrounded by an aura of power. He was sitting at the restaurant's main table with his 34-year-old wife Vanessa by his side. They had married just 2 years ago after a brief but intense romance. Vanessa has always been the woman Richard imagined being her soulmate. Beautiful, intelligent, and charming, she seemed to have everything he wanted in a partner. He felt that he had finally found happiness. But that night something was different. Richard could not identify what it was, but there was something in the air that made him rest. He tried to focus on the conversation with Vanessa, who was excited and talking about the new philanthropic project they had begun to fund. However, the luxurious atmosphere and relaxed conversation could not push the feeling that something was about to happen. Suddenly, a young girl entered the restaurant. She was about 12 years old, with lame clothes and a lost look. The girl looked out of place amid those well-dressed and elegant people. Richard noticed the girl as soon as she entered, but didn't pay much attention until abruptly she began to walk straight toward her table. "Sorry, sir. Can I talk to you for a minute?" The girl's voice was trembling, but there was an urgency in her words. Richard, surprised, looked at Vanessa, who seemed equally disconcerted but did not oppose. The restaurant was a little noisy, but the girl didn't seem to notice, as if the world around her was disappeared. "Of course, what do you need, girl?" Richard asked, although a little bothered by the interruption. The girl looked at him with a frightened expression, as if she had just escaped something terrible. Her eyes were wide, and her breathing was irregular. "Your name is Richard James, right? Are you married to a woman named Vanessa?" the girl asked, her eyes fixed on her face, as if trying to read every detail. Richard became even more uncomfortable. He nodded. "Yes, that's right. What do you want, girl?" The girl took a deep breath as if she was preparing to say something very important, something she was weighing on her mind. She looked around, as if she feared being heard, and then, with an expression of terror, she said, "Uncle, your wife wants to kill you today." Richard was completely paralyzed. He looked at the girl, not knowing what to think. A homeless girl, visibly disturbed, saying something so absurd and terrible in the light of daylight, in a fancy Manhattan restaurant. He looked at Vanessa, who was now wide, clearly shocked. "Are you crazy? What are you saying?" Richard asked, trying to recover control of the situation. The girl, however, didn't seem to hesitate. She looked straight at him, as if she knew something he didn't know, something that could change everything. "I saw her. She spoke to someone. I don't know who. They said she would kill you tonight after dinner." Richard's world seemed to be crumbling around him. He looked at Vanessa, who no longer looked as calm as before. Something was wrong. Vanessa's expression had changed from an expression of surprise to something more calculating, something Richard had not seen in her before. She avoided looking into the girl's eyes, and her hands shook slightly as they held the glass of wine. "Vanessa, what's going on?" Richard asked, his voice tense, trying to understand the truth. She looked at him, and for the first time Richard saw a shadow of something she couldn't identify. She smiled, but the smile didn't come to the eyes. "Richard, you need to calm down. This girl is delirious." She tried to reassure him, but there was a cold distance in her voice that Richard had never noticed before. The girl, however, did not seem willing to give up. "She's lying to you, Uncle. She's not with you because she loves you. She's with you for a very different reason. I saw them both planning." The girl's voice failed. She looked at Vanessa with a look of dread, as if she feared anything else. But before I could say more, a restaurant security guard appeared, asking what was happening. Vanessa got up quickly and went to the security guard, explaining that the girl was just disturbed. Richard was silent, feeling a mixture of confusion and fear. But as he watched, the girl was taken out. He couldn't get one thing out of his head. Her statement, "Your wife wants to kill you today." The story was just beginning, and Richard would soon find that nothing he knew about his life was true. Richard was still, his eyes fixed on the girl, still trying to sue what he had just heard. She was so nervous, so scared, she could barely keep her eyes. The environment around him seemed to have disappeared. The elegant restaurant, the murmurs of other tables, everything was distant, as if time had stopped. Vanessa's sweet perfume and the soft sound of background music were now drowned out by the girl's trembling voice. "Uncle, please, you need to believe me," she repeated, almost no breath. "I saw her. She and the others. They will do something with you." Richard swallowed hard, but his mind was 1,000. He tried to look at the girl calmly, but could not disguise the growing tension. "Who are they? What did you see, girl? Who's wanting to kill me?" The girl hesitated, as if trying to organize thoughts before speaking. She was talking to a man. He had a tattoo on his neck, was big, well-dressed, and she looked so quiet. "But I saw," what she said, "that it would be today, at dinner, after you eat." Richard looked at the table, where the wine was still in the Vanessa cup. How could she be involved in something so macabre? He looked at the bathroom where Vanessa had entered moments earlier, and a strange feeling began to take care of her body. It was as if something is about to happen, but he didn't know what. Something was not right, and the sensation only increased as time passed. The girl continued, trying to explain. "She loves you, isn't it? But it's not for you. I heard her saying, I don't know the name of the man, but she was talking about the money. She wants the money and you won't be necessary anymore." The girl's words were like a punch in the stomach. Richard felt the blood warm, the anger taking over him. How could your wife, that woman he shared a life, have something to do with it? He wanted to scream, but the truth was still incomplete. He needed to know more, needed to understand what was going on. He lowered his voice and asked firmly, "Do you know who this man is? Do you know where he is?" But the girl was so agitated that she could barely answer. She shook her head quickly, as if she was afraid of something even bigger. "No, Uncle. I can't. They'll get me. They'll—" Suddenly, the restaurant's security guard returned to the scene after being alerted by the manager about the girl's excitement. He approached with firm steps, but was interrupted when Richard, with a voice that sounded more authoritarian than he himself imagined, said, "I want to know what this girl has to say. You'll give me more time. What she's saying may be true." The security guard hesitated, clearly disconcerted by Richard's firm posture, but respected the request. He walked away, leaving the billionaire and the girl alone. Richard looked back at the girl, who was now quieter but still with big and suspicious eyes. "Please do nothing to her," Richard asked himself more than anyone else. He felt the need to protect the child, but at the same time, the fear that he was right left him in a vulnerable position. He needed to know the truth. The girl, now calmer, looked straight into his eyes and spoke in a lower voice, almost like a whisper. "I saw his face. I saw in the man's face. He was talking to her, and she has a secret. If you find out what it is, maybe you don't have time. I can't help you anymore, Uncle. They're around." Before Richard could question her more, Vanessa returned from the bathroom. She was smiling, her face illuminated by a calm glow, as if nothing had happened. But something was wrong. When she looked at the girl, her eyes were frozen for a second, and soon she looked away, forcing a forced smile to Richard. "Sorry for the delay, dear," Vanessa said softly, but there was something in her voice that sounded strange to him. The conversation with the girl seemed to have left her tense. What is happening here? Why is this child so agitated? Richard, still stunned, tried to stay calm. He looked at the girl, then to Vanessa. He felt that every second was weighing more and more, as if it were the point of rupture. I need to know what is happening. She said that you are involved in something very serious. And that," Richard has faltered for a moment before finally, "She said you want to kill me." Vanessa was still, his eyes narrowed, and Richard for the first time noticed a slight tremor in his hands. But she soon recomposed herself and smiled, though forcibly. "Richard, you're listening to bullshit. This girl, she's crazy. Let's not pay attention to it." She approached him, gently touching her shoulder. "Let's let it go, dear. Let's go back to our dinner." But Richard couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The girl's words resonated in her mind, and now more than ever she felt she was in a trap. But how to get out of it? How to find out the truth without losing everything? He needed to understand who his wife really was, Who was the man she was getting involved with, and what else she had hidden from him? The tension between Richard and Vanessa was palpable. The restaurant atmosphere, which once seemed like a refuge of luxury and tranquility, now became a prison of uncertainty. Richard tried to soothe the conversation he had just had with the homeless girl, but her words continued to echo in her mind, creating a tangle of doubts and fears. He looked at Vanessa, trying to find some answer in his eyes, but all he saw was an expression of disguised discomfort. Vanessa smiled softly, but the way she avoided her gaze made him restless. She looked anxious but tried to disguise. "Let's relax, dear. This is just a disturbed child. There is no reason to worry about it. Let's enjoy the night, as I planned." Richard nodded, but his mind was distant. He couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was about to happen. The dinner, which once seemed an opportunity to reconnect with his wife, was now becoming a mined field of unanswered questions. Vanessa continued to speak, her soft voice, but her eyes on her eyes was different, more calculating, almost as if she was watching every movement of Richard, hoping that he gave up his search for truth. "I was thinking about our vacation, dear. Maybe we can go to the Caribbean next month. What do you think?" Richard looked at her without hearing the words for a moment. All he wanted was an answer to the questions that now hammered his mind. He moved away from the table, trying to find some kind of clarity. "Vanessa," he said firmly, interrupting his word flow, "I need to know what is happening. You're hiding something from me." Vanessa's smile broke out for a moment, and Richard first saw a brief prosecution of nervousness. She looked to the side to the waiter who was approaching to remove the dishes, and then turned her attention to him. "Richard, you're being irrational. I'm not hiding anything. Maybe it's stress, work. You know how it can affect us." But Richard was not convinced. He knew there was something else, something that was not being said. The way Vanessa looked away whenever the subject was approaching the girl, the light tremor in her hands, the forced smile. All of this formed a puzzle, and he could no longer ignore him. "I'm going to find out the truth, Vanessa," he murmured, his voice low but full of determination. Before Vanessa could answer, Richard looked to the side and realized that the girl was back. She was standing near the restaurant door, watching them with an intensity that made Richard's heart accelerate. She seemed to have calmed down, but her eyes were still big, as if she had seen something she shouldn't. The girl approached again without hesitation, and with a serious expression said, "She won't stop until she gets what she wants, Uncle. They have the power to destroy you, knock you down. You don't understand, but I saw everything, she and the man. They know what to do, they know how to catch you." Richard felt a pressure on his chest, as if being crushed by an imminent and inevitable truth. The man. The mysterious man of the neck tattoo. His mention seemed to be the key to the mystery that was crumbling over his life. And Vanessa, always calm and controlled, now seemed farther, as if an ice layer had formed between them. Vanessa looked at the girl with disdain and rose abruptly, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "I already told you, girl. Get out of here. You don't know what you're talking about." But Richard could not look away from the girl, who for the first time seemed stronger, more confident. She was no longer afraid. "I can't stay here anymore," she said, the most serious voice. "But I know you'll find out everything, and it's going to be too late." Before Richard could say something, the girl turned and left the restaurant, disappearing in the crowd outside, like a shadow that dissolves in the dark. Richard was silent for a moment, his mind spinning around her words. Too late. What did she mean by that? And why did Vanessa seem so uncomfortable with the girl's presence? He looked at his wife. Her smile no longer looked so soft, and her eyes now avoided Richard's. The air between them was loaded, and the sense of distrust grew every second. "Richard, you're imagining things. None of this makes sense. Let's go. I don't want to discuss that anymore." Vanessa was visibly annoyed, her defensive and tense posture. She took her bag as if she was preparing to leave, but Richard didn't let her go. "No, I won't leave without knowing the truth, Vanessa," he said, his voice firm. "What are you hiding from me?" The tension between the two was palpable. Richard felt that at that moment he was in the cliff of discovering something that could destroy everything he believed about the woman with whom he married. But at the same time, something inside him said he was closer to the truth than ever. But what would he do with this truth? Were you prepared to face the consequences of your findings? The conversation with Vanessa that night had reached a point of no return. Richard knew that somehow his wife was deeply involved in something darker than he ever imagined. The homeless girl, with her unsettling words, had been the starting point for a journey that was now crumbling over him. What else did she know? And what else had been hidden by Vanessa? He could no longer ignore the feeling that his whole life was built on a lies base. Vanessa seemed increasingly distant and impatient with her questions, and Richard could no longer be convinced that it was all a mistake. He walked away a little, taking a deep breath. The thoughts were disordered, and he knew he needed more information. It could not continue in that uncertainty. "Vanessa, you won't stop me from understanding what is happening," he said, trying to keep calm. "I won't let it pass." She looked at him with a forced smile, but her eyes cheated on a growing fear. "Richard, please, you're being irrational. Everything we're going through now is just a phase, a passing crisis. Let's go home and talk later, without this strange girl." But Richard could no longer ignore the signs. Vanessa's coldness, her resistance to the questions, and above all, the mystery around man with tattooing. All this was more than clear now. Something was very wrong. He knew he needed help to find out the truth. He no longer relied on his own perceptions. The next morning, Richard decided to do something he had never imagined to be necessary. He hired a private detective. Hours later, Richard received a call. The detective had something for him. "Richard, you will want to hear that. I found something very strange." Detective began to describe the details of an investigation that seemed to be linked to Richard's wife. She wasn't who he thought. The detective said he had found records that associated Vanessa with dubious activities, something Richard would never imagine. Vanessa was linked to a network of financial corruption, but most surprising of all was the name of the man she was in contact with, the man with the tattoo. It was Daniel Pierce, a name Richard immediately recognized. Daniel was a clean facade entrepreneur, but with a dark history. There were rumors that he was involved with criminal organizations, and now Richard was confronted with the reality that his wife was in collusion with him. But what was she doing to him? How did it affect your life? And more importantly, what was Richard's role in this plot? As he reflected on the information, his mind also turned to the homeless girl. She knew something that was not yet clear to Richard. She knew Vanessa's involvement with Daniel, and more than that, seemed to have a glimpse of a dark future. Richard didn't know what to do with all that information. He felt more lost than ever, but something inside him said he couldn't stop there. He could not let Vanessa go unpunished, could not ignore the secrets she hid. The detective continued, as if he knew how much those revelations were moving with Richard. "There is one more thing. You need to go to Vanessa's house. There are documents that she is hiding there. Something about a secret account." With a turbulent mind by adrenaline, Richard decided to act quickly. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to confront Vanessa directly. He needed to know once and for all what she was doing and how it involved him. That night, after a tense and wordless dinner, Richard got up, leaving Vanessa silent. She watched him with a look that he couldn't decipher, and he knew this would be the last moment of peace between them. He needed the truth. Arriving at their house, Richard went to Vanessa's office, where she always kept her rolls and organized documents. He opened the drawer, with the feeling of violating something sacred but without another choice. Between documents and old papers, he found an envelope with the logo of an offshore bank account. The name of the account was in a code, something he did not recognize immediately, but the reference was clear. And there was the name of Daniel Pierce, with a reference number that seemed to be the key to something even greater. At that moment, Richard felt the weight of revelation about his shoulders. He had a concrete proof that Vanessa was involved in something much more dangerous than he ever imagined. She not only wanted her money, she was somehow being part of something much bigger, something that could destroy her life. But as he held the envelope, the feeling that something else was about to happen, there was a pressure, as if he were about to be swallowed by a whirlwind of lies and betrayals. The revelation about Vanessa's secret account was such a strong blow that Richard could no longer be convinced that it was just a coincidence. The truth he feared was before him, but before he could completely digest the implications, something even more disturbing happened. What he didn't know was that the pieces of a much larger puzzle were fitting, and he was about to find that the threats that emerged were not just empty words. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. The envelope with the name of Daniel Pierce and the offshore bank account were on his table, but his mind was in an internal war. Vanessa had become estranged for him. The woman he loved seemed to be involved in a world of lies and betrayals, and every piece of information he discovered away from him, more and more from those he believed to know. While the morning arrived, Richard made a decision. He wouldn't wait any longer. He needed to confront Vanessa once and for all and understand the role she was playing in this macabre game. But before he could organize himself, a call interrupted his thoughts. It was the detective. "Richard, you need to know this now. I found something important." His voice was tense as if something had changed. Richard felt his heart accelerate. "What is it? What did you find?" "I went after more information about Daniel Pierce. There's something that wasn't on the radar. There's a direct connection between him and his wife." The detective paused, as if prepared to deliver even heavier news. "But there is more. I followed its clues to a home in Long Island. Daniel has a hiding place there, and you will not believe what I found. Vanessa, she is involved in a much larger plan. She and Daniel are not just dealing with dirty money. They are linked to something much more dangerous." Richard felt a feeling of ice through his veins. "What do you mean with something more dangerous?" The detective hesitated for a moment. "There is a sensitive information trafficking network. Companies, politicians. It's much deeper than you think. Vanessa is not just a dishonest wife. She is a key piece in something that goes far beyond her imagination. She is committed to the neck." Richard's mind turned. Vanessa? Involved in something so dark? He felt like the floor was opening under his feet. He thought he was dealing only with a betrayal, but now he understood that he was in a corruption web that threatened his life in a way he could never have anticipated. How could she get involved with something like this? And more importantly, why was she doing this? What was her goal? "Are you sure what you're saying?" Richard asked, trying to stand in reality. "I'm sure. And there's more. Believe it or not, she's planning something tonight, Richard. I don't know what it is, but her behavior is strange. And she won't give you a second chance. It won't let you know everything." The call was interrupted and Richard was there, paralyzed, holding the phone with sweaty hands. He knew that night Vanessa was about to do something irreversible, something he could not stop, but could still try to understand. He had one last chance to face the truth. He got up from the chair, took the envelope with the tests, and went to the room where Vanessa was. She was on her back to him, talking to someone on the phone. He approached silently, listening only to the words that came out of his mouth. "Yes, everything is ready. At 9 p.m. He will fall. Richard will not understand what happened. It will be fast." Richard froze. He knew she was talking about him. Vanessa was planning something for that night, and he couldn't stand still. When she hung up the phone and turned, the smile she offered was not of affection, but of an architect plan. He saw the coldness in her eyes, the same look he had seen that night in the restaurant when she tried to deny the girl. It was not just a matter of money or betrayal. It was a matter of survival for her. "Richard, you don't understand," Vanessa said with a soft voice, but her eyes burning with determination. "I did it to us. You need to understand that this is bigger than you. We both are in a game you never imagined. You are the final piece." He stepped back, the anger growing inside him. "You cheated on me, Vanessa, and now you're killing me inside with that. Everything we did, everything we built was a lie?" She looked at him with a cold smile. "Everything. And the worst is that you never knew." Richard stepped forward, finally staring at the woman he loved. Her words echoed in her mind as the truth took shape. But he still didn't know what to do with this truth. He was not prepared for what she wanted him to become. "You'll destroy everything, don't you?" Richard said, his voice hoarse, the fear mixing with anger. "I never thought you could be capable of it." Vanessa didn't answer, but her eyes in her eyes said everything. He now knew that the woman he had married was a stranger. And worse of all was that he was stuck in a game where the rules were never clear, where the only truth was the lie. And that night, marked by Vanessa's final decision, could be the end or beginning of an even bigger nightmare. Richard stood before Vanessa, trying to understand the depth of the words she had just pronounced. The silence between them was heavy, loaded with an unbearable tension. He felt the weight of every word she had said, as if everything he believed was safe was crumbling around him. He wanted to scream, question, demand answers, but the words failed. What should he do now? How could he deal with the woman he loved who was now revealing such a dark and distant face from the person he knew? Vanessa, on the contrary, seemed calm, almost satisfied. She watched him with a mixture of contempt and patience, as if waiting for something she already knew would come. She didn't seem surprised or sorry, just decided. "Richard, you were always so easy to manipulate. I thought you would see, but now you are so lost that there is no return." She smiled coldly, almost fun. as if seeing his despair and finding everything a game. He didn't know what to do. What was happening to your life? How did he not notice how involved she was? He had been so naive, so reliable. He tried to process everything he had discovered in recent days, from the homeless girl to the private detective, and the revelations about Vanessa. But now it seemed that the end was too close, as if a fog of confusion had taken over his mind. The tension took over his body as he approached Vanessa. "Are you telling me that everything we went through was all these years a scam?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes, what you and I called with love was just a facade game, Richard. I manipulated you. You were a tool, a piece in my plan, and it was not difficult because you believed in me." Her words hit Richard as a punch in the stomach. He felt a wave of anger, a desperate need to make her understand how broken he was, how much he had been destroyed by the woman she trusted most. But before he could react, Vanessa stepped forward with an enigmatic expression. "You still don't understand, aren't you? This story is far beyond you. Daniel Pierce, the money, the secret account, it's all part of something bigger. I did it to ensure what is ours, Richard. Because you, even with all your money and influence, could never get it alone." Richard swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. She had used it as a bridge, a tool to achieve her own goals. But there was something else. Vanessa's gaze, her calculating behavior, showed that she was far beyond any kind of regret. She was convinced of her actions. "And do you think I'm going to stand here while all this happens?" Richard asked, his voice full of anger and frustration. "You used me, you are wrong, and now you are destroying me inside." Vanessa looked at him with an empty smile. "You were always weak, Richard. This is not about you. This was never about you. I always knew what to do to achieve what I wanted. And in the end, everything fits. Nothing you do now will change that. The game is already won." He felt a wave of desperation to take care of him. What could he do? She was right in a way. He was being left behind, thrown out of a game in which he never had control. She had accurately planned everything, manipulating him, leading him to believe that he was in control of his own life. But in reality, she was always the real strength behind everything. Richard walked away from her, feeling the pain spread throughout the body. He needed to do something. I needed to step out of this nightmare. But how? He felt he was being pulled to an abyss, with no way out. But the truth about Vanessa, her betrayal, her plans were finally clear, and he could no longer ignore. With his mind on whirlwind, Richard took the envelope with the tests the detective had given him, and looked at Vanessa, the woman he thought he knew. "Do you think you can control me, Vanessa? What can you destroy everything I am?" She just smiled once again, with a smile of contempt. "You can try, Richard, but you will lose. I always knew you were weak. Now you will understand the true price of your ingenuity." As Vanessa walked away, Richard stood there, her heart beating hard. He didn't know how he would deal with everything he had discovered, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to be so easily defeated. The war that began among them would be more intense than he ever imagined. Anger and pain began to consume Richard as a merciless force. He never imagined that the woman with whom she married could be so deeply involved in such a dirty and treacherous game. What he felt was not just the weight of betrayal, but the sense of impotence in the face of overwhelming truth. Vanessa had planned everything, orchestrated each movement, manipulated not only him, but the whole life he believed to be real. And now, he was alone in the middle of a web of lies, with his hands tied. But Richard was not a man who gave himself easily. He was a billionaire, someone who had built his life and empire from his own strength, even when the world seemed to crumble around him. He had overcome numerous obstacles in his career, but nothing had prepared him for the personal betrayal he was experiencing. Now he knew he needed to rebuild himself, not just as a businessman, but as a man, as a human being. The first thing he did was to seek answers. He would not allow Vanessa to continue to manipulate his life and his perception of reality. He already knew what was at stake. The money, the power, all that she had involved in her plan were just pieces of a puzzle that he needed to understand completely. He would need more information, more allies, and more courage than ever. So Richard went back to the detective. He needed to know more about Daniel Pierce and the corruption network to which Vanessa was on. The sense of urgency pressed him, as if time were a weapon against him. He needed to act fast before she could make her plans. Plans that involved not only money, but also her life, and the lives of many other people. With each passing day, Richard was more determined. He knew he could no longer depend on anyone, not even his wife. The confidence in her, which was once unshakable, had disappeared as a smoke. Now, he had to look at the future with a different, sharper, and more focused mindset. He needed to be stronger than ever, because the truth would not be easy to swallow. The detective, with whom Richard finally made a solid deal, revealed more details about Pierce's criminal network and how she was infiltrated in various spheres of society. Vanessa's plan was deeper than Richard imagined. She was not just looking for money. She was building a dangerous alliance, a bridge between economic power and the underworld of crime, all to position herself as an important player on a global network, and he was her pawn in this game. This all transformed Richard. The pain of betrayal was still there, but it mingled with a sense of clarity. He was not going to be another victim. He had begun to feel lost, but now he was finding his way back, stronger than before. He had the resources and intelligence to turn the game. He knew he couldn't do it alone, so he began to seek allies, people he would never think of involving, but now they became crucial in his fight. He knew that his fortune and influence could be used strategically, but he also knew this would not be enough without a well-structured plan. Richard was learning to control his emotions, not giving in to panic or blind anger. Each movement, each decision, now had to be calculated. Vanessa and Daniel were in a position of advantage, but he had something they didn't have: the ability to reinvent themselves, to reinforce when everything seemed lost. He was beginning to realize that the fight was not only against Vanessa, but against everything he had ignored for years: his own confidence, his own lack of vigilance. In a moment of deep reflection, Richard looked in the mirror, trying to find the person he was before, the man who believed in love, trust, human relations. That man was still there, but now he was more cautious, more attentive. He would not let his humanity be corrupted by pain. He would not become a bitter or vengeful one. But your mission was now another. He was willing to use his strength to restore his life, even if it meant destroying everything he thought was right. Gradually, he reconnected with his roots, with his values. The fight was internal before it was external. What would he do next? How would you react when you finally confront Vanessa again? He knew she was about to make the last move, but he would no longer be caught by surprise. He had strengthened, both physically and emotionally. Richard now knew that the real enemy was not Vanessa. It was the game she forced him to play, and he was ready to turn the rules in his favor. It would no longer be a puppet. No more. He was rebuilding, stronger, more intelligent, and above all, more determined than ever to win. With each passing day, Richard felt more prepared for the final confrontation with Vanessa. He had set up a meticulous plan, a chess game where each piece was strategically positioned. The pain that once weakened him now propelled him. He was no longer the man who blindly believed in his wife's trust. He was becoming a stronger, more aware of his own limits and his choices. Nothing else seemed insurmountable. He knew that to turn the game he would need more than information. He needed the trust of the right people, allies who were willing to face him, and what was most important, the truth about Vanessa and his plans. And the key to all this was in the man she was protecting, Daniel Pierce. The first step was to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with Vanessa. He had already planned a meeting with Detective where he would get the latest crucial information. But more than that, he knew he needed to understand his wife's mind, perceive his weaknesses and blind spots. He needed to arm himself emotionally and mentally. It was a battle that involved both the mind and the body. Richard began to study the details of the corruption network, the people Vanessa was manipulating, and how they connected with Daniel Pierce. He found that Vanessa was not just trying to destroy her life. She was trying to build an empire. She did not see him like her husband, but as an obstacle to be removed. And Richard, as painful as he was to admit, was becoming a key piece for her in her search for power and money. However, with each discovery, Richard became more determined not to allow this to happen. He was beginning to realize that to end the manipulation cycle, he would need to face not only Vanessa, but also the ghosts of his own past, the mistakes he had made in his personal life, the omissions that had allowed her to control him for so long. He could no longer hide behind his wealth and status. He would need to use his intelligence, strategy, his courage. The match was in his hands. The last piece of the puzzle was the meeting with the homeless girl. He had tracked his location, knowing that it could be the key to dismantling Vanessa's empire of lies. She knew more than she was willing to tell, and Richard was determined to get from her the information that could be vital to ensure his victory. It wouldn't be easy, but he had no time to hesitate. The fate of your life depended on that conversation. On the morning of the meeting with the girl, Richard prepared for the final revelation. He had spent the night reviewing everything he knew. Vanessa was about to give the final blow, but Richard felt that there was something more than had been revealed yet, something the girl could know and would make all the difference. He found the girl in a community shelter, a simple place without ostentation. She was calmer than last time, perhaps because she realized that he was no longer the person she imagined. Richard approached her with caution, but with the need to answer all doubts. He sat next to him, keeping his calm. "I know you have more information about my wife, about what she's doing. Please help me, I can't wait any longer." The girl looked at him with big, deep eyes, as if weighing her words. She knew how important that moment was. "You don't know, sir. It's not just about money. It's not just about you. She's linked to something much older, much more dangerous. And what she wants, Richard, is not something anyone can just stop." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" "She has a goal, much darker, something she won't give up. I saw her with that man, with Daniel. They are playing a dirtier game than you can imagine. But the truth is in you, Richard." She spoke with a more serious, almost desperate tone. Richard felt a feeling of despair tightening his chest. With each word, the notion that he was about to enter a territory where the rules were beyond his understanding became clearer. He was on the eve of a confrontation that would change everything. She continued, "You can still save what's yours, but it won't be easy. Vanessa has much more control than you think. What she has with Daniel is not just about money. It's about something more, something that will put you and everyone around you at risk." The conversation ended abruptly. The girl got up and disappeared on the streets, leaving Richard with more questions than answers. He felt a growing urgency. He didn't know exactly what Vanessa was planning, but now he was better prepared for what was coming. He knew that within hours the confrontation, and I knew the manipulation game she had been playing would finally be unmasked. But the question still remained. Would he be strong enough to deal with the consequences of his actions? Was it ready to fight to the end? The night had arrived. Richard was at the center of an emotional, mental, and physical whirlwind. He knew he was about to do something irreversible. The tension was palpable not just in the air but in every cell of your body. The meeting with the homeless girl and the revelations she had made clear that Vanessa was playing a much more dangerous game than he imagined. He had the tests, the information, and above all, the determination to end it all. But more than that, he knew that confrontation with his wife would be a watershed. He was no longer the vulnerable man who blindly trusted her. He was now a man with a clear goal: to unravel the truth, to expose lies, and to recover the control of his life. No matter what happened next, he would not be manipulated again. Richard entered the house where Vanessa was waiting for him. The atmosphere was silent except for the soft sound of classical music in the background, which seemed a strange contrast to the tense situation. Vanessa was sitting in the living room on a velvet couch with an unbeaten expression, as if she knew that everything that was about to happen was already in her plans. She looked too calm, as if nothing shaken her, but Richard knew she felt the pressure that her game's pieces were about to be turned. He approached her with firm steps, the envelope with the proof of his betrayal in his hand. He would no longer allow himself to be a spectator of his own life. He was ready to make the last move. "Vanessa, I know everything. I know who you are, what you are doing, and who are involved with," Richard said in a firm voice. "I won't be your puppet anymore." Vanessa looked at him with a cold smile, but his eyes were no longer the same. There was a shadow of insecurity in them, a slight hesitation that Richard had never noticed before. "You're wrong, Richard. There's no idea what you're saying. I did everything for us. I love you. You know that. There's nothing you can do to change what is already done." Richard laughed with bitterness. "Do you love? You have no idea what love is. What you did with our life has nothing to do with love, Vanessa. All you did was manipulation. I gave you everything, and you used me as a tool for your own purposes." He got closer, throwing the envelope on the table, where she could see the evidence he had gathered. The secret account. The connections with Daniel Pierce, the documents that no longer left for doubt. Vanessa looked at the papers with an empty look, but for a brief second his eyes faltered. "Do you think you can destroy all this?" "What can you destroy me?" she said with a short and bitter laugh. "You never understood, Richard. I've always been the key piece here. You've never been the brain, just the facade. I've always been the power behind everything. And now you're trying to get it out of me?" Richard felt a chill. He knew that the battle that was waging with Vanessa was not just about controlling his life or money. It was a battle for power, for dominion, for all that she believed to be her by right. But as much as he wished, he knew he could no longer fight for her. Not the way he was doing before. He was no longer going to be a piece in her game. No matter what happened, he knew he needed to stop running after the woman who destroyed him and finally taking the reins of his own life. "You may have controlled it all so far, Vanessa," Richard said with a cold calm. "But from now on, the rules are mine." Vanessa stood abruptly, her eyes now burning with an unexpected fury. "You can't stop me, Richard. You'll never understand what's at stake here." She made a quick movement, as if to attack, but Richard was prepared. He knew what she was able to do. With an agile movement, he took the gun that was hidden at the table, a last letter he had prepared to make sure nothing was left at random. She looked at the gun, her expression moving to a mix of surprise and anger. "Do you think this will change something?" But Richard didn't raise the gun. He looked at her, and for a moment, the tension between them was almost unbearable. He no longer wanted violence. He no longer wanted to run after revenge. What he wanted was the truth, the power to control his own story, and that required nothing but courage to face what was before him. "I don't need that, Vanessa," Richard said with a disturbing calm. "I just need you to understand that the game is over. It won't be the one who will decide what will happen to my life." Vanessa stared at him, his firm posture, but his eyes were now far away. She knew he had won. The control she thought had about him had been broken. She walked away, and for the first time Richard realized that she was really vulnerable. She no longer had the weapons she used to manipulate him. All she had now was an empty field of lies and manipulations, and that was no longer enough. "You lost, Vanessa, and I'll expose everything you did," Richard said, the weight of words settling in the air. Vanessa turned without more words and left the room. Richard stood there, taking a deep breath, knowing that the battle had been won. But the price he paid was high. He would no longer be the man who believed in love and trust fantasies. He had become something stronger, more prepared to face whatever was needed to stand up. Richard's victory was not just about Vanessa. It was about himself, about his ability to meet, reinvent himself, and finally take control of what he once seemed uncontrollable. Richard was alone in the room, the echo of Vanessa's words still reverberating in his mind. He had won the battle, but the cost was immense. The pieces of his world, which once seemed so perfectly fitted, were now scattered, and he was forced to rebuild everything, starting again, from scratch. It was not just a matter of destroying what Vanessa had created. It was more than that, the reconstruction of his own identity and his view of who he was, the truth about Vanessa, the betrayals, the secrets, all now was part of a past that he needed to leave behind. It wouldn't be easy, and he knew that the weight of pain and disappointment would follow him for a long time. But at the same time, he felt a renewed strength within himself, a force that came to face the truth without fear, to finally end the control she exercised over him. The next morning, Richard summoned a press conference. He knew the way ahead would be long and complicated, but there was no room for lies anymore. He was ready to expose everything Vanessa's corruption network had created, the schemes with Daniel Pierce, the manipulation he had been a victim himself. He would no longer hide the truth. For the first time in a long time, Richard was no longer concerned with his image, what people thought of him. He needed to break free from this prison of lies. The event was a milestone. When the press gathered, Richard began to tell his version of the story. He talked about what he had discovered, the betrayal of Vanessa and his participation in the corruption scheme. But that's not just what Richard shared. He also talked about his personal journey, how he was lost in his blind trust, but also how he was finally meeting again. He was no longer ashamed to admit his flaws. He had learned that to move on, it was necessary to embrace the truth, no matter how painful. In the following days, Richard's life began to change. He not only saw his public life being reformulated, but also had to deal with the emotional weight of what he had just faced. He lost someone who thought he was the soulmate, but in return, he won something that could never be bought: freedom. The freedom to be who really was without further manipulation, without further lies. He knew that there was still much to be done, to rebuild his confidence in people, re-establish his personal relationships, and understand what the future reserved. But for now, he felt he was at peace. As the clock continued to mark the time, Richard knew the reconstruction journey was just beginning, and he was ready for whatever was needed. For after all that has gone through, he knew one thing for sure: no one would control his life anymore. Now he was the sole owner of his destination. Months later, Richard began to rebuild not only his life but also his empire. The truth about Vanessa and her schemes was exposed, and the court followed her course. He made new allies, rebuilt his confidence, and slowly found a sense of purpose beyond wealth and power. The pain of betrayal was still a shadow, but he knew he had overcome the worst. That chapter of his life was closed, and Richard finally broke free from the currents that held him. Now he was ready to write a new future, without more lies, and with more courage than ever. Now that you know the story of Richard and his journey of self, discovery, and overcoming, we want to hear from you. What would you do if you were in his place? How would you face the betrayals and secrets that shake your trust? Share your thoughts, experiences, and reflections in the comments. And if this story has touched your heart, be sure to share it with friends and family. Sometimes the biggest challenges teach us the most important lessons. Join us and we will continue to talk about the truths that shape our lives. Don't miss the next story.